So welcome to part one of implementing universal design in academic librarianship. Basically, what I'm going to do today is identify what ableist practices and assumptions in education are, uh, give you an understanding of the basics of universal design and why using them is vital in librarianship. And lastly, using the chat, I want to engage in a discussion of what barriers to learning, some of your students, and for those of you that might not be in academia, what your patrons might be facing and what can be done to eliminate those barriers. So the first thing I want to do, and I know I see there's a lot going on in the chat, but I want to ask if you can answer this question in the chat. I know I was not very familiar with ableism when I first started working in at LaGuardia Community College. But can anybody tell me what ableism is? Not using Google or AI. What when you hear that term ableism, what does that mean to you? And you can put your answer in the chat. Okay, I see. Assuming everyone has the same abilities and capabilities, yes. Assuming that all people are able-bodied and can access spaces and information in the same way, yes. And I see. Uh, I, I'll explain why I just stopped in a few moments, but um, I noticed the assumption that the rights and needs of able-bodied people supersedes those of other individuals. I noticed in the chat systematic bias towards non-existent normal. Okay. Give it another minute just to have some of you put down your thoughts. And I'll explain why I just stopped speaking for a second, because one of the things that I focus on in my instruction and even speaking to colleagues is not use terms like you can see this in the slideshow or you can hear this in the video, because those are not inclusive terms for those that might not be able to see or might not be able to hear. So I try to stay away from those terms, and every time I notice myself using those terms, I try not to. So when we think about universal design, sometimes we can think about it in small ways, not just that grand picture of what we can do, but think about these small steps that we can take to having that design for all. All right. As I said, ableism was not a term I was familiar with before I got into this work, and it is really crucial. It is key to kind of recognizing these social justice and equity challenges uh, for people with disabilities. Some of you, I notice in the chat, are very familiar with it, but I think it's important to take a moment to define it more clearly. So ableism is a discriminatory system in which those with abilities are often overlooked, undervalued, dismissed, or targeted, and those who are able-bodied and or able-minded are favored, privileged, and considered normal. To address ableism, we need to first grow awareness of it as an equity, ethical, and social justice issue. And second, we need to practice in inclusive pedagogies similar to those that consciously address forms of discrimination, such as those based on race, gender, class, culture, etc. Uh, in their book, Academic Ableism, Disability and Higher Education, Jay Dolmage acknowledges the history of ableist practices enacted by academia in the guise of research, such as experimentation on those considered abnormal based on race, culture, sex, ability, or class. Some of this has a direct connection with the practice of eugenics that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century. Domage also encourages those of us affiliated with academia to take responsibility for changing it. In academic ableism, Domage focuses on spatial metaphors that come from within the field of disability studies that nicely articulate the way that space excludes, the way that space can be redesigned, and the ways that space can be more inclusively conceived. What we can think of this as steep steps that exist as a retrofit of how space is redesigned, and universal designed as the ideal way to make the world more inclusive. Domage uses this image, which is called the approach at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, to illustrate the physical and the cultural inaccessibility that happens in academia. So in the image, there are several steps leading to the institution without any indication of a ramp or elevator to access the space that's in there. So it's not inclusive for all. And in this 2022 CUNY photo that you resonated with me, there's a screenshot that shows a set of stone stairs at a CUNY campus. And this was on the CUNY.edu homepage. And it really echoes the previous image of stairs. And the article here is called More Praise for CUNY's High Quality, Low Cost. And it does have that same image where we have that steep steps and not the inclusive design to be accessible. Although I think here on the right-hand side, I think we do see a ramp, but it is not totally in view. I think we can apply ableism beyond academia and see how it can be thought of in various types of libraries as well, for those of you that may be outside academia. Steep steps that exist at any library can be physical spaces like steps or ramps in the approach to the classroom or studio, but also in a course layout or a workshop design, in text or documents provided to users, in responses to student work in a classroom, in paper prompts or assignments, in workshops and collaborative design, and on library message boards and websites. Disabled people have traditionally been excluded both from buildings and from the ongoing building of academia. Academic ableism leads us to believe that, in fact, there are some specific bodies and minds that do not at all have a right to the university, and that the university tries to filter out certain bodies and minds. The university has been constructed as a place for the very able, where the steep steps is a movement upward. Only the truly fit can survive that climb to the top. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, universities were popping up in rural places at the same time that asylums were popping up in other nearby rural settings, and how these sites of incarceration in close proximity to universities, where one group of humans could be held and studied by another. We continue to build universities in service of and on top of the history of eugenics, lifting some bodies upwards towards privilege upon the footings of segregation and oppression. Also, in academic academic ableism, we noticed that they uncover the social construction of disability on campus that often mandates that disability exists only as a negative, uh, private and individual failure on a person. Very little space is made for the building of uh, collective or interdependent disability politics. And lastly, sickness and wellness programs might be defined as contemporary opportunity structures for forms of eugenic thinking. The authors of the book challenge us not to just recognize where and how ableism happens, but to ask what the impact will be of exposing it, what the cost might be of assigning blame, and what the forces are that make it imperceptible, what the euphemisms are that to disguise it, and how it comes to be normalized, even valorized in academia. The author poses the questions: what if higher education isn't creating knowledge and ability, but instead is systematically disabling? Or perhaps less uh, controversially, what if higher education constructs both knowledge and disability? And what if these constructions rely on one another? A major turning point at LaGuardia for universal design was in 2017 and 2018, and I'm happy to be a part of that, which kind of led me into the work that I'm doing now. And it was a program where we had collaborated with 5 students, 5 faculty members, and several staff in what was called Designing for All. And we realized how important it was to hear directly from students. So I want to play a short video of one student's experience at LaGuardia, about how they how, how they were treated in academia.
Please find a link to the video in the description below. We did not include the clip in this recording to avoid potential issues from this video platform. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a very powerful video on student experience at LaGuardia that was negative at that time. And every time I hear that, every time I notice that video, I shouldn't use terms like here. Every time I take that video in, it bothers me because I know that these things are happening, and I always try to make ways that we can improve the culture that we have in academia. And I also want to play another video which goes over some possible invisible disabilities that we may have in the classroom, and with students that we may handle at a reference desk.
Please find a link to the video in the description below. We did not include the clip in this recording to avoid potential issues from this video platform. Thank you.
It's important to consider those students that have quote unquote invisible disabilities that we may not be aware of and that may not be reported to an office. Based on the U.S. Census American Community Survey in the year 2015 to 2016, the following groups reported having a disability: 19% of all enrolled undergraduates and 12% of all enrolled graduate students, 19% of male undergraduate students, and 20% of female undergraduates, and 10% of male and 13% of female graduate students. And lastly, according to data from Yale University, approximately 11% of U.S. undergraduates register a disability with their school. Okay, so I want to do a little bit of a discussion in the chat. And the question that I have is what barriers to learning and or performance have you encountered during your education and career? And how are you supported? Because I'm sure at one point or another, you may have had a barrier to learning and maybe performing in a class. Like, what has been your experience? Because I'm sure we all have shared one moment in our time. I'll share my own experience. I've stuttered since I was 3 years old, and you know, I mean, has it impacted my life? Yes. But I do presentations. I do library instruction. I teach a credit class. I'm at a reference desk. So it hasn't impeded my life, but I did have barriers in the past where I did not want to, speak because of it, being teased at times when I was younger. And these are some of the barriers that I faced because I, stuttered. Um, and how was I supported? Well, I did, luckily in high school, I did have maybe I was kind of spoiled, but teachers wouldn't call on me because they knew that I stuttered. So maybe it would have been better if they had called on me because I maybe would have gotten uh to speak more. But oh, I see some writing in the chat. Um, I should say, I noticed writing in the chat. I keep on making that mistake. I had to take extra reading training programs through high school. I still read super slowly. Um, I also noticed in the chat difficulties receiving timely accommodations. Yes. I know things in academia, as we all know, can be slow to have those accommodations. So notice in the chat, sensory sensitive. The world is too loud and too bright. Yeah, so having that space that is accommodating uh, for all of us. I also noticed in the chat lacking confidence and self-conscious of visible scars. Okay. After coming back from maternity leave for each of two kids, I needed a private space. Okay. Um, I, you know, I know in one of the colleges that I worked at, one of my colleagues was always looking for that private space um, after maternity leave. Also in the chat, severe exhaustion and persistent headaches, um, other neurological issues. Okay. I have screen time induced migraines. Yes. Feeling like discussions are moving too quickly. Yes, I do find in particular, with the chat, that sometimes or even in person, I always had a hard time focusing on quick moving conversations. Um, I was told to reschedule a long outstanding appointment because I was scheduled during class, uh, a chronic illness. Yeah, so I see, we've all had some sort of an experience in the past that was a barrier to our learning, having to deal with chronic pain when I was younger. Um, yeah, and looking for that support, can be difficult. Like I said, I was kind of spoiled by my teachers in high school, not in elementary. I went to public school in Queens, and they they really wanted me to speak, especially my sixth grade teacher. But when I went into high school, it was like I hibernated. Um, I have a follow-up question to that we can discuss is what might have made what have made your learning or performance e easier and more effective um, in in light of all these barriers that you face? Well, I speaking for myself, I did take speech classes to to quote unquote get rid of my stutter, although it's not something that you get rid of. But I think thinking about things that would have made things more effective and easier for me to having the environment in a classroom not so um, where we have all of the students looking one way and teacher looking this way. I always spoke better, I thought, when we were in a circle where we could see everybody, where it wasn't just like, well, the people behind you, where we could be be aware of everybody's presence. Let me see if anybody's writing in the chat. I'm a good writer, but have difficulty in oral expression. I cannot remember having any support. Growth mindset language. Okay, I see more time to take tests would have helped me. Yes. And my slow reading. Yes. Yes. That's one thing that universal design considers is having time to complete assignments. And one thing that I do uh, in the class that I teach, I make sure that students have that available time. I do post all of my assignments in advance because I know some students, I know I was like this when I was a student. I like to get things done in advance as opposed to wait until the night before. So I was like when I could get to do another assignment because I knew I would, I did like that, having that, space to work. Having flexibility, deadlines, mastery, okay? In response to not having access to the syllabus and weekly assignments, I would really wish my instructor had appreciated that I was just asking for what I needed to be successful without asking for extensions. As I read some of what's in the chat, UDL also addresses motivation, self-confidence, purpose. Yes. Yeah, so thank you for sharing your thoughts. Part of this exercise of what I've had you view, listen to, was to get a sense of why universal design is important because we've all faced some sort of barrier in our life, and sometimes I think things could have been made easier if we had a space where all of um, all of these things could have been accounted for. All right, so getting into universal design, universal design is a model that addresses and tries to reach everyone. Um, it, it it originated in architecture, but its usefulness is definitely seen in academia, in libraries in general. Uh, it's a little over 20 years old, but here's an illustration of the distinctions among equality, which is the level playing field, and equity, which in the case is providing accommodations, and then going beyond that into liberation. So in this image, there are people at a ballpark with varying heights trying to see the playing field. And equality has everyone standing on the same size box, looking over a fence with one unable to see the field. Equity then rearranges the boxes so that everyone can see the field. But lastly, liberation removes the fence and the boxes for all to see the playing field. Um, archi Architect Ron Mace defined universal design as the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. One principle of universal design, or UD, takes into consideration that products and environments are useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. For example, this could be a website that is accessible to everyone, including students who are blind or that have low vision and use possibly a, a text-to-speech software. Another principle takes into consideration that products and environments communicate necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities. For example, this could be ensuring that a video used in a course has captions. And also, like myself, not using terms like see and hear, which are, I guess, because of how I was trained how to speak, we do use these terms that not all of us have the ability to do. An additional principle of universal design takes into consideration that products and environments can be used efficiently and comfortably with a minimum amount of fatigue. For example, this could be a lecture hall where doors open automatically for people with a wide variety of physical characteristics. So in academia, universal design goes beyond assuming that a statement about the Office for accessibility in a syllabus is enough for students. It Universal design also provides options for students, such as the option to write a paper or create a short video for their final project in any given class. I know sometimes I like to give students that ability to use their creativity in a video because some of us are better writers than others. Some prefer to express themselves possibly in a video. Universal design offers materials that are accessible for all learners with or without disabilities. In my class, I always provide print handouts and electronic versions of materials and assignments for, for those who use screen readers or perhaps prefer an electronic copy. And the one thing that I forgot to do earlier, every time I start a session in Zoom with a class or in person, I always have a link to my slideshow on the screen in case somebody wants to view it uh, on the screen in front of them. Because I mean, I knew I didn't get glasses until I was older, and there were times when I used to squint to see what was up on the screen. Um, but having that option to be able to view a slideshow on the screen in front of you, can be helpful for some. Universal design considers students at the margins of the educational system by providing open educational resources over costly textbooks. And lastly, universal design removes barriers that rather than trying to fix the learner. Uh, for example, in my experience, I've had some students struggle with following instructions for an assignment. So, you know, incorporating universal design, I kind of want to uh, place the issue not on the learner, but perhaps my instructions were not clear. So, whenever I have a student that says I didn't understand, how I was supposed to do something, I always take that to as a consideration that I may have to revise some of my assignment prompts because maybe not everybody understood, what I meant. Okay. So in that case, removing that barrier to learning so that all students are able to easily follow the instructions. So universal design the thinking, to sum it up, eliminates and prevents the barriers for students in these areas, in technical barriers, by ensuring the physical and digital materials and spaces are easily available for all learners, and pedagogical thinking, how teaching and learning can be an ongoing process with multiple options and welcoming spaces. And lastly, in cultural uh, uh, ways, by cultivating an awareness of equity and intersectionality as it relates to attitudes towards those considered or classified as disabled. You know, this is also known as examining ableism. Right. There are several different schools or schemas of universal design. There's universal instructional design, or UID. There's universal design of instruction, which is UDI. There's universal design of assessment, UDA. But one of them, which you are probably familiar with, is Universal Design for Learning, which was developed by the organization known as CAST. It is often referred to by its acronym UDL. And here's a short breakdown of the framework um, of uh, of UDL. It was developed um, as a framework for developing curriculum that is more accessible for all, including students with and without disabilities. It considers the needs of students at the margins of the educational system. Its central premise is that the curriculum, rather than the learner, needs to change because there is no average or typical learner, and that all learners have varied abilities, strengths, experiences, and preferences. Uh, two, fun, two fundamental things are to address learner variability and to reduce barriers in curriculum and instruction, with that ultimate goal of UDL is to develop expert learners. And learner variability may include users' abilities and strengths. Some users may have a better ability for verbal over written discussion. As I mentioned before, in the case where I give students options to maybe express themselves, um, uh, give verbally in a class as opposed to writing, or vice versa. The variability factors may also include support needs, such as a note taker or a screen reader. Another factor is the background or experiences of users. Some may hail from another country and a different heritage language than English. And lastly, we all have preferences and interests which do make us unique. Good. I have one more video to kind of encourage us to think about, you know, hitting all students. And here's an interesting video that puts inclusive education in the guise of bowling.
Please find a link to the video in the description below. We did not include the clip in this recording to avoid potential issues from this video platform. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a little bit of an analogy. Oh, thank you for putting that into the chat. I did forget again to put the link to the video, which I normally do. I will put all the video links and the slideshow into the chat again. All right, so a question that I have, and I would like you to respond, to think about, is what uncommon challenges have you observed in students or patrons that you have at your library, depending on what kind of a library that you have you worked in. I, I, I know specifically we have some students that may require a wheelchair. And I know there's one student in particular where the size of their wheelchair, um, or I should say, our space does not accommodate the wheelchair. And specifically our library instruction room, uh, this particular student cannot get into that space because the the rows are too narrow for a wheelchair, even to get to the space that is designed for a person using a wheelchair. So, what uncommon challenges have you observed with students? Please write your answers into the chat. Some things that I've, have already spoken about is instructions there where I see that not everybody um, understands what it is asked of them in a class, whether it's an assignment or, or a final. So if I do hear feedback where somebody doesn't understand, I always try to make sure to make a note. If I do use that assignment again, I'm going to revise those instructions based on the feedback that I got. I noticed in the chat difficulty following written instructions for information literacy activities. Yeah, and one thing about universal design is not putting the focus on the learner. It's also on the instructions. Maybe they need to be revised to accommodate everybody. And not the easiest task to do because I think especially in academia we try to sound academic. And some of us, our students are not academics yet. They possibly will be one day. And sometimes I think rewriting those instructions is helpful. Students with ADHD, yeah. I mean, I think in our age, that is a big consideration when thinking about designing a classroom for all. As a supervisor, recognizing which student workers need very explicit direction or redirection. I am reading what's in the chat, not a student, but with a colleague who is blind. We were at an employee development workshop that required filling out a web form. Yes, yes. Actually, one thing that I have done, the head of media here at LaGuardia Library, and we used to use print forms for students to fill out. And when I took over the media unit here, in addition to being web services librarian, I was like, we need to get rid of these web forms because not everybody can fill these out or can actually, see them. So that was one of the first things that I, did. Um, I also have in the chat neurodiverse students. Yes, students who walks around looking like wasn't it. Okay, all right, all right. So everything. So other things I know is the resources the institution is willing to provide are geared toward mitigating legal risk for accommodation. Yes, yeah. I think a lot of things that are done are just done to you know things that are just done for the moment and not thinking about the gr greater picture. All right, and one last thing I just want to th throw out there to 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 have you put your responses into the chat is what would you like to change in your work with your students, with your patrons, and can you help? So please, write your responses to that in the chat because I think we can think and as I mentioned earlier, it's not to think about that grand thing that has to be done that's going to make everybody, you know, uh, equal. But think of small things that that you can do in your work. And as I mentioned now a few times, I have this thing I continually say, you see in the slideshow, you hear in the video, and that's something that I'm so trained to say. It's very difficult to to break that. All right. So think about things that you can change and think about your universal design and think about, hitting as the analogy in the video. not hitting the pin head on, trying to get to the most difficult things possibly in our work. All right. So I do want to say there is a next session where you can bring some of your ideas. We are going to have that at the Graduate Center. It'll be part 2 of this workshop series. It'll be on April 10th from 11 to 1 p.m. In that, you will learn some common accessibility obstacles and easy fixes that align with library instruction and library resources and services that take into consideration UB principles. You'll be able to contribute to an inclusive learning environment for students by using these concepts and practices. And you'll also ensure that the materials used or developed in library resources are accessible. All right. So if you want to join us for that, that will be in April. And lastly, I'll take any questions in the chat that I can answer. Okay. Enjoy, everybody. Bye-bye.